Hi everyone, welcome to our third Discord event. I'm very excited to be hosting this one. We are hosting Rosie and Sky from Safe in Our World, and we are talking about a topic that we feel incredibly passionate about at MLC. Around the world, the data shows that within the games industry, you're more likely to live with a mental health condition. And so Safe in Our World are working really hard to stamp out the stigma of mental health issues. And we've recently signed up to their LevelUp program, which you can find out more details about on their website. Their goal is to support, raise awareness and change attitudes towards mental health issues. So Sky and Rosie are going to tell you more about that and give you some top tips on how to avoid burnout. Over to you.
Awesome. Hello.
Hi.
Rosie, do you want to go first for intros?
I can go first for intros, yeah. So, hi, everyone. I'm Rosie, she, her, and I am the content and community manager at Safe in Our World, which basically means I get to do a lot of the fun stuff. And that was very much a theme from the very beginning when I first started, because when I first started, there was just two of us, and Sarah, who is our manager, took the not the boring jobs, I would say, but like the more, the official sounding, like, the constitutional things. And I was just like, I'll do social media and I'll do like, videos and stuff. She was like, absolutely, yes, that's fine. And so it's kind of just like been my niche since that started, which was almost 2 years ago. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. And I'm Sky. I use they, she pronouns. And I've actually only been with Safe in Our World for about 7 months now. And I have kind of taken over some of the quote unquote boring jobs. Thanks, Rosie.
No worries.
But I run our LevelUp mental health program, of which MLC is a new partner. And I'll be telling you a little bit more about that soon. I mean, for me personally, I think that it's fun, but I do like my words and my spreadsheets and things like that. But it's been very rewarding to see how much positive change there is in the industry, and talking to our just over 100 partners that we have now, seeing the things that they've implemented has been really good. It gives me hope that our mission is doing something and we are getting somewhere in terms of the cultural shift. But what I'll do now is I'll pass you back to Rosie, who can give you a little bit more background about Safe in Our World as a charity if you've not heard of us before. Go ahead.
Yeah. So we are just over 3 years old now, which is really exciting, but also wild because it feels like so much longer than that. But we officially launched in 2019 on World Mental Health Day, which is the 10th of October. And basically, the entire purpose of what Safe in Our World is here for is to support the mental health of people who play games, people who make them, but all generally destigmatize the conversation around mental health, because it's such a huge thing that everyone lives with, and it's for some reason still stigmatized, for no reason really. So one of the main things that we try and do is a lot of outreach in terms of talking about mental health, making it a conversation that is acceptable to have, but encouraged to have as well, so that no one's afraid to reach out for help and talk about these things if they need to. I am very open about my own mental health. I suffer from anxiety and depression, and I'm feeling that I'm undiagnosed ADHD as well, but I'm looking into that at the moment because it's like a process. But I think it's incredibly important, and the link to games is very specific because so many people explore their own identity, their own mental health, and connect with games in a way that you just don't see a lot of other media do. And I think it's important to be able to put the conversation around mental health into a topic that is fun and exciting and relevant, and being able to talk about it in that sort of realm, I think is a really unique perspective that not many people have, which is why I love doing it so much. And so one of the things that I get to do in my role is to look specifically at video games themselves and potentially highlight games that have accurate representation of mental health within the actual characters of the games, or tackle certain themes within the narratives that drive this conversation forwards. As many of us know, a lot of video games can have like kind of difficult tropes around mental health, specifically like in the horror section, for example, where a lot of the time you look at like mental health as the cause of something evil, for example. And so like we're actually starting to work with developers directly to help them in the development process get that right and be able to not add to the stigma when they're trying to talk about mental health in games in a positive way, which is really exciting. But I've kind of gone off piste. So one of the main things I get to do in my role is the website, which is a huge hub of information that I think is our most valuable asset in a lot of respects. We signpost to so many different resources on our website that are global. So it's not just UK based, as a lot of people might assume. We try and have global resources that are supportive of anyone, and not just necessarily crisis support lines, but actual information hubs and support groups and chat functions, which is a huge thing for me, as asking for help is hard enough as it is, and then getting on the phone with someone to do that, mortifying. So having a chat that's actually helpful is crucial for me. But then we also have a lot of information. So if people are just wanting to learn and listen and try and understand a little bit more about mental health, we have so many resources on our website for that as well. And then one huge part of my job is podcasts, which is obviously having discussions with people about their experiences, which I think is super powerful, because listening to people who are figures in the industry that you know or you look up to or are in senior positions, I think is really important for them to also share that it's very human for us to have these experiences. And talking about them only helps eliminate the stigma, but also seeing people who we know might make it okay for us to talk about it as well. And I know that's certainly the case for me, but I think it's important to be able to talk about this topic with specifically anybody, which is what I try and do on the podcast. So we've had interviews with game developers, with people who've been in the industry for years and years and years. We've had content creators on board. We've had so many different people come on and tell their story and their different experiences, which I think is important, especially as a lot of the time the conversation around mental health, specifically in the UK, is very white focused. And I think it's important to share everyone's experiences around it so that we know what's out there, we know the support, and we also don't stigmatize specific conversations around mental health conditions based on one specific demographic. I've gone completely off piece. I'm so sorry. This is why I think I might have ADHD. But anyway. So yeah, that's a little bit about Safe in Our World. And I will kind of pass you back to Sky to talk about what they do in their day-to-day as well.
Yeah, sure. Hello. So I've been popping a couple of links in the chat as Rosie's been talking, so you can see our website and our podcast there. So the support that we offer for the games community is about half of our remit in terms of the games industry as a whole. Other half is about employers and companies within the industry. I'm sure that I don't need to say that our industry hasn't had the best reputation for supporting its employees. And even, to this day, there are oftentimes things that come out which are quite shocking and quite upsetting. And our aim through LevelUp is to change the industry in as much as it relates to those topics and that lack of support. So our program called LevelUp Mental Health, which I'll also pop the specific link for in chat there, is designed for companies to join us and to commit to making those changes. And in part, we hold them accountable. So we will follow up with them and make sure that they are putting practical things in place. But in part as well, our goal is to connect them with the resources they need to actually be able to make those changes. Obviously, there are issues within the very big players in the industry, but a lot of times companies in our industry are small and they don't have an HR person, let alone a whole HR department. So they can't access a lot of the information, the training, the documentation that it's important that companies put in place when it comes to supporting people's mental health and well-being. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well in terms of how it relates specifically to crunch and burnout. But through LevelUp, when our partners join us, they get monthly free training opportunities as well as some bigger ticket pieces that we offer throughout the year. They get a lot of documentation and support, like template policies that they can just go and use if they don't have a policy already and don't know where to start in making one. And we're actually starting to build a little bit more of a community now that we've got over 100 partners, and start sharing some of the best practice of what our partners are doing. And we will look in a minute as well at a kind of a snippet of that best practice as it relates to crunch. But the ways in which we're sharing that is some of our partners have written testimonials to talk about what they've done since joining us. Some of them have produced videos to demonstrate some of their initiatives. So as an example, Ripstone Games produced a video about their weekly walking club that they do as an incentive to, get out and get exercise for your well-being, but also to give their team a chance to just not be in work mode and kind of get to know each other a little bit better. That's on their Twitter, and it's on our website as well. So you can check that out actually without being a partner. And we also have a little internal podcast series, which is separate from the Safe Space podcast, which is our public facing one. But in this internal podcast, which is just for LevelUp partners, we talk about all sorts of things that our partners are up to. So we'll look at one that talks about crunch specifically, but we've also looked at like policies around menstrual leave. We've looked at policies around like mental health days, and how, for example, Ubisoft Reflections, one of their UK studios, talked to us about how they help their employees with their sleep patterns and sort of practicing good sleep to help them within work. So there's a lot of different ways that companies can support, and these are the types of things that we're aiming to engender throughout the industry, so that, well, the employees are supported and the companies aren't treating them horribly, basically, is the long and short of it. So that's a little bit about LevelUp and what we offer to the industry. But I know on this panel, we're going to be talking specifically about burnout and crunch, which are two issues that are very prevalent in our industry, and they are quite niche to this sector or the entertainment sector as a whole, for reasons I'm sure we'll go on to explain. But I'll pass you back to Rosie real quick, who's going to tell us a bit of information about burnout.
Yes. Hi. So burnout has kind of been something that I think we've definitely seen more talk about it within like generally like on the news and things as well, especially from COVID, which I think is important. But burnout in general, just looking at the official, like, what's the word? Descriptor, I guess. I'm really annoyed that I can't remember the word now. Definition is actually something that's resulting from like chronic workplace stress. And a lot of people, I think, misconceive it as being just kind of feeling very tired and that's it. Whereas actually burnout is really damaging and exhausting, and it's characterized by three different things, one of which is exhaustion and energy depletion completely from work. The second is mentally distancing yourself from your job or feeling negative or cynical towards your job. And the third one is you're less efficient at your job. And so it's a combination of those three things all coming together that end up leaving someone incredibly put out is a nice way to put it, but from your job. And it's something that's seen a lot in the games industry. We often see it after, and it's very much related to crunch. We often see it after periods of crunch where people obviously are working overtime, the compulsory overtime, in advance of a release or a big announcement, and it can be really damaging. So burnout isn't just like, oh, like you have a hard week and then you finish and then you're like, oh man, yeah, I need a nap. That's good. That's great. And then you come back on Monday, you're fine. It can go on for months. And I've seen a lot of people in the industry actually have to completely stop work for months because of burnout, because it is just too much. And so I think one of the best things that we can do to combat burnout is to actually look at how the person became to be within burnout itself. So a lot of the time people are like, okay, well, how can we help you specifically in this situation, which is great, and that's good, as important as well, but we need to look at what's the underlying issue into why they feel as though they must burn out. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, one of which being that the industry is one of the most passionate industries I've ever been in, and people will honestly not realize they're burning out because they enjoy the work that they do, or feel as though that they have to burn out in order to prove themselves within their role, which is also related to imposter syndrome, which I can talk about all day long because I think it's really interesting. But for those who might not know, imposter syndrome is basically feeling as though you're a fraud within the achievements that you've accomplished, and you've somehow gotten there by chance and bamboozled everyone into letting you get into the job that you are in right now. Which can have so many different effects, but one of which can be burnout because you feel as though you're constantly having to prove yourself. And so it is a big issue in the games industry, and it's very much tied into well-being as a whole, because there's lots of different ways that you need to triangulate to support someone who is going through burnout or might be on the cusp of burnout. And it's not just to do with work, it's to do with general well-being as well, which includes helping people with sleep, which is what Sky's mentioned about before, helping people with the trio of well-being, which is like sleep, exercise, and nutrition, which we've also done a topic on our website for. If anyone's interested, we've got a few resources there as well. But for me, it's about getting that work-life balance, which I think is incredibly important. And having things like walking clubs, which Sky mentioned that Ripstone have done, is a huge way to be able to target something specifically through work, whilst also doing work in that sort of way that's not like you're sat at a desk and that's all you do. So I think that's important. I'm talking a lot, sorry. I'm like... I think also one of the issues with burnout, which I think needs to be addressed from senior levels, is workload, which it sounds obvious, and it is, but often something that is just not addressed when people are burning out, because they'll come back after having a break and have the exact same workload and end up doing the exact same thing and plateauing into a state of burnout. And so by working with someone who is struggling with burnout, by setting achievable goals, by working with them on time management, but also supporting them in terms of what they should be responsible for, what they are responsible for, how other people can support them in their work, and slowly getting back into it instead of just being like, hey, here's all of your assignments, let's go. So I think it's important, but also kind of leads into the culture of the company as well, and making sure that everyone has the same vision and it's not just one person kind of feeling as though they're on their own, and feeling guilty for taking the time that they need to support themselves, for example. So there's like a bunch of different things within that. And I don't know if Sky wanted to chip in as well, because I feel like I've just talked a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that you've covered burnout really well, and it's good that you've picked up on some of the sort of associated issues like imposter syndrome. And I do think that leads well into talking about crunch, because the two are, often intrinsically linked. So crunch or crunch culture is, as Rosie said, compulsory overtime, which is often unpaid in advance of a deadline. It's something that is very common in this industry because of the strict release schedules that a lot of studios work to. And it can be a very difficult issue to tackle, because even if you are doing your best to avoid crunch as a developer, for example, you're working with other people who within their own companies will crunch, and therefore will expect you to crunch, and may not be receptive to asking for deadlines to be pushed and things like that. So it can have this knock-on effect when you try and tackle it, and that's why it's such a difficult issue to actually tackle in the first place. One of the things that I would like to do is I'll share my screen in a sec, if that's okay, and just show you a quick video or clip from our internal podcast where Tracy Clark, who works at Sega, talks to us about their overtime policy and how they kind of tackle crunch in the workplace. So I'll do that now, and then we can chat about it in a minute afterwards. Let me hopefully do this first try without messing up. Share my computer sound. Okay, let me know if you can hear it as soon as I hit play.
Obviously, there's lots of talk within the industry on crunch. I've heard some horror stories where people have it written into their contracts that it's mandatory. As part of our standard contracts, it does say that you may be required to work overtime, but within Hardlight, we have it that it isn't referred to as crunch, it is referred to as overtime if we ever need to do it. It isn't something that we just allow people to do. So if we have a new project for release and we have to pull together and put in some extra hours to make sure that's delivered on time, overtime is opened up by the studio director, so it has to be agreed by him. It's voluntary, you don't have to do it, and any hours that are worked over your usual hours, you are given back as toil, so time off in lieu. And if you work over 2 hours within that overtime period, if you work over 2 hours of an evening, we supply you with dinner and stuff as well.
Cool. So that was just a really brief snippet of Sega talking about how they handle it. But I think that there are a few really important things there that we can pick up on. And that actually ties into one of the questions that was asked ahead of time in chat, which is how do you make sure everybody is on the same page about what crunch is and what it is not? So the specific pieces that Tracy mentioned that I wanted to talk about is, number one, the terminology that they use. They refer to it as overtime rather than crunch. And I think that is a really important distinction, because when you say crunch, there is this overarching kind of assumption or expectation that, oh, we've all got to band together, we've all got to do this, it's non-negotiable, it just has to happen. Whereas overtime is a work phrase that people understand the impact of, and the fact that that means it is paid is a huge distinction there, of course, as well. So I think that is one of the most important things to make sure people are on the same page, is being clear about the terminology you use. And then the second piece is actually having a policy in place to address this. If you don't have those types of policies, it leaves the decision about overtime or overworking really up to line management or whoever it is believing that they need to stay late. And when you're leaving that decision to individuals, that means that it's open to interpretation based on that individual's perspective, that individual's home situation. For example, it's much less likely that people who have to pick their kids up from school are going to be available to do overtime versus someone who is like living alone or something. So having actually a specific policy in place that addresses how overtime is handled is very important. And I did like what Tracy mentioned about how their CEO will take accountability for any overtime worked, because when it comes to organizational change for any topic, and particularly the sort of broader topics like mental health in general, it's so crucial to have buy-in at a managerial level, at an industry leading level, because sometimes issues can fly under the radar. And if your CEO or whoever in upper management isn't aware of it, things will go unaddressed, because generally speaking, the people who are experiencing crunch and burnout aren't going to feel like they're in a position to speak up if they don't feel like senior leadership has their back. One of the things that I will pop in the chat as well now is a link to a page on our website which has a toolkit that is called the Community Manager's Mental Health Guide, but it is applicable to a broader audience than just community managers. It's something that we put in place because we do a specific mental health first aid course for community managers, but the toolkit itself is geared toward supporting you through instances of burnout. It talks about how to put in place boundaries to make sure that you aren't reaching the point where you're working too much to the point that it affects you mentally and physically. It looks at different self-care practices you can have in place, how to address these things in the workplace, etc. So I'd really recommend that as something that you download and have a little read of, because it can be really useful just to have that kind of reminder. And the toolkit breaks it down into sort of 10 easy steps. So it's not like an overwhelming amount of information. Because I suppose that's another thing that it'd be relevant to pick up on now. And we can probably talk more about it in a minute when we get on to sharing a bit of our personal experience with these things. But oftentimes when you are suffering with mental ill health or you've reached the point of burnout, it's at that point that you are the least equipped to get help because you are already in such a bad place. As Rosie alluded to earlier, it's incredibly difficult to actually get help and take that first step. And I mean, getting a doctor's appointment in the first place is extremely difficult. Oftentimes, even getting 10 minutes to talk to your line manager is extremely difficult. And a lot of the onus is on you, the person suffering, to keep following up and to keep trying to be heard. And when you're at the point of physical and mental exhaustion that burnout can bring you to, you can't put in that effort, which is why it's extremely important to look at things like, what are my signs that I'm reaching the point of burnout? And I mean, it is unfortunately for some people, such as myself, something that you don't know about or realize until you've kind of experienced it. And I suppose, Rosie, unless you had something else to add, I'll kind of segue into talking about a time that I experienced burnout.
I was just going to actually say one thing. So in relation to recognizing the symptoms of your own burnout and the signs and things like that, we actually made a template of a plan that you can download on our website, which let me just find it, because that is a good thing to link to when I'm referring to something. And it's basically like the layout of something that you can give to other people as well. So it's not just for yourself, but for other people. And I think we called it like a crisis plan or a support plan or something. But basically it lists like who you can reach out to if someone's in crisis, but also like the signs to look out for, someone who you can reach out to for peer support. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm like doing this totally from memory. And it's it can be really helpful if you struggle to use your support resources when you're in that place, which I specifically struggle to do as well. So having a plan that you can you don't have to think about, oh my gosh, who could I talk to? Like, what should I do? It's literally like, oh, it's all written down for me from when I was thinking more rationally, for example, and now I can actually just follow that. So that's a useful tool to have. I'll find that, Sky, when you start talking about your experiences and put it in the chat as well.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, you're right. That's a really good resource. And I think it can sometimes go by different names. We've called it a crisis support plan, I think, but some people will call it a crisis card or something like that. And that is actually something you can share with your employer and with your team if you feel comfortable to do so, because it can be beneficial to have someone else in your work environment kind of looking out for you and being able to spot those signs, because again, like we've mentioned a couple of times, it can be really difficult to spot those within yourself. So I'll talk now about
it's not just me that it's paused for, has it?
No, technical difficulties.
Are you back?
There we go. She's back. We lost you, Sky.
Out. Am I back?
Yeah, you were like, cool. I'm going to talk about, and then it just stopped. So
I'm sorry, my internet's been so bad for a couple of weeks. I'm really just grateful it hasn't completely crashed so far. So I'm going to talk about a couple of specific instances, one where I've experienced burnout and one where I've experienced crunch. I'm not here today to put my previous companies on blast, so I'm not going to mention any companies by name. But I also didn't work in the games industry before I joined SAFE. So these are experiences I've had in different sectors, but that are kind of broadly applicable and sometimes linked, because one of them was in the entertainment industry, which has very similar issues when it comes to deadlines and things like that. So the first time I experienced burnout, and luckily the only time I've experienced it, was actually only about a year ago in my previous role. And it's something that I had no idea that I was experiencing I'd heard the term burnout, but like when Rosie was explaining it, I just sort of thought that meant being a bit tired or like fed up. I didn't really conceive of it as something that would affect me in the way that it did. And for me, it's something that came on very, very gradually over the course of probably about 6 months. And in my workplace, we were going through a lot of changes within the organization, which were, I would say, poorly implemented, which is another thing we offer for our LevelUp partners actually as a resource specifically about change management, because that can be one of the most stressful situations for employees, is like how a company successfully implements change. But I mean, it was a period of about 6 months where every couple of weeks we were being told to do something different. And in a lot of cases that we should have been doing that thing differently the entire time, and we weren't told about it. It was very stressful. It involved doing a lot more administrative work, which when I was in sort of a public facing role was very difficult to manage with the appointments that I had to conduct every day. And this went on for, as I said, many, many months. And throughout the course of those months, I was starting to feel extremely tired all the time for a start, but not just, like I said, a bit tired and fed up, but it was really struggling to have restful sleep, feeling just worn out in every aspect, like physically throughout the day, and really like I was having to drag myself into the office. I was struggling with getting a full night's sleep because of the amount of stress that I was under. And it was affecting my ability to concentrate while I was at work, which in turn was affecting my performance. And I was beginning to resent my workplace more and more in terms of what they were putting me through, which in turn had an impact on my overall performance. But when I was kind of reaching crisis point, I started to have a lot more physical symptoms. So, for example, I was losing hair. I was feeling just sick and sort of unwell. I was getting a lot of headaches. My sleep was getting even worse. My appetite was basically non-existent, and therefore like my eating and sleeping and all of those patterns of that triangle Rosie was talking about were just gone. And it did eventually reach the point where I had to take time away from work, and I had to step back and just decompress. And when I was able to come back, it's something that I really looked at putting boundaries in place, both in terms of the hours that I was putting into my job, but also the sort of emotional input I had in the job. And I was trying to separate myself a lot more from what was happening at work, because it was having a significant emotional toll on me. And it wasn't actually really until I joined SAFE and I started looking into this terminology a little bit more that I realized that what I'd experienced actually was burnout. And now that I understand it a little better, I can see when it's potentially affected, colleagues of mine and things in the past. And it's something that I'm really interested in looking out for in colleagues, like Rosie and Sarah. I'll always try and check in with them and make sure that they're doing okay, and vice versa as well, which is really good.
It's very nice.
But that was it's such a weird situation, because if I'd just been sick with a cold, I would have called in sick to work and been like, I'm not well enough to work today. But because it came on so gradually, and because it wasn't like, a defined illness in that I could see it, I just kept going, and I kept pushing myself far beyond the point that my body could really take. And I hope that people don't have to get into that situation to recognize it. So I really would recommend reading up a bit on burnout, using the resources on our website, using that CM toolkit. so that you can start to spot the signs, because it's really not a place that I would ever wish anyone to be. But if you have been there, being able to identify it and take action ahead of time is really helpful. One of the things that our manager Sarah does with us quite regularly is just checks in regarding our workload. So as an example, a couple of months after I joined, we had a check-in, and I said, actually, like, I am getting a bit bored. I feel like I could take on some more work right now. But then like a month or two ago, I had another check-in where I said, actually, I've got so much on my plate, I'm starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed by it. Can we just talk through some things? And is there some stuff that you can help me with? And being honest like that is really important. I'm very lucky that I have a good manager who I can be honest with. And that we can kind of work together to put a plan in place to tackle that. So that's kind of my experience with burnout. I'll talk a little bit about when I experienced crunch as well. So this is in a different previous job, and this was in the cinema industry. And we were opening a really big, important flagship location for the cinema company that I worked with. And I was the manager of that location from before the point that it opened. So I was having to go through all sorts of things like making sure that the place was actually being built on time, and sort of getting involved in like the construction element, which was a little bit above and beyond what I was expected to do as just a manager of that cinema. But it's something that I was just kind of like thrust in the position of doing. And it was one of those kind of, yeah, all hands on deck. We've all got to try and get this place open. So you have to do this thing that isn't your job. And that sort of situation of crunch. And I was doing all the hiring for the location and all this kind of thing. I was working upwards of 70 hours a week during that time and not being compensated for anything over my base hours of 39 and a half. And again, I am very fortunate that I have never put myself back in that position, because 70 hours in a week is something that now I can't even conceive of myself doing that. I don't think that I physically could anymore, but because I was like sort of 19, 20 at the time, and really trying to prove myself, which is another issue this industry has, that people just feel so lucky to be in the position that they are, that they will go above and beyond what they can kind of cope with. And that's the situation I was in. And it was my first job. I was managing this big, shiny new cinema that, well, not my first job, but my first job as a manager. And I'd been trusted with this flagship location, and I really wanted to do amazing at it. And I was young, I was desperate to prove myself. And so I ruined myself in that few months of crunch leading up to the actual opening of the cinema. And I was so stressed, and there were so many things that sort of went wrong and weren't necessarily completely fixed by the time that the cinema opened. There wasn't a lot of time for the team to actually get trained. So looking back on it, that didn't put them in a good position, because people were, going into a new role either as doing things within the cinema that they've never done in previous jobs before, without really the amount of training that they should have had. I think that the team, in terms of like crew, had 5 days of training before our opening day. And it was also the busiest opening day that the company had ever had. So it wasn't just like a really, chill time where you serve one person and then have 10 minutes to like catch up with yourself. So that was a really horrible position to be in. But at the time, I didn't recognize it as that. And I don't think that really anyone that I was working with recognized it as that, because we were all just swept up in the excitement of it. And I do think that is an issue that this industry really suffers from, is that people feel really lucky to be in an industry that they love so much and they care about so much, that they are willing to put themselves through more than they should. And there's also an expectation for them to put themselves through more than they should. I mean, we've heard from a lot of people that their line managers will say, we interviewed hundreds of people for your job, so you're lucky to be here and you need to prove that, because we could replace you in a heartbeat. And that is where, at a policy level, at a senior leadership level, things really need to change, because people should not have that kind of emotional blackmail put upon them to force them into sort of a crunch situation.
I also think within our industry, you know, there's lots of indie devs and solo devs that, you know, it's their passion project or whatever. So it's, you know, they get wrapped up in it, and before they know it, you know, they're experienced burnout because they just want to get it out and stick to their deadlines and stuff. But so yeah, I think it's not even just in the big studios. It's also the people doing it to themselves because they want to get their game out.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, I mean, my advice, having experienced those things, would just be, it's not worth it. And it's not worth putting your body through that. It's not worth putting your mind through that, because the amount of time it takes to recover from that feeling is enormous. And a lot of time it's something that keeps affecting you for, you know, like months and years afterwards. And just, yeah, remember that you're the most important thing.
Yeah, 100%.
Rosie, I don't know if you had any experiences you wanted to share.
Oh, I have many, but I will do the most relevant. So, in terms of burnout, I think it came hand in hand. So it was crunch and burnout together in this lovely dual package. It was at a previous job. I'm also not going to put them on blast, but it was during the pandemic specifically. And so for context, I used to work in events, and I would do support in some pretty high profile events on a volunteer basis. And that was like kind of daunting enough, because it was like, oh my gosh, I get to do all these really cool events. That's amazing. And then COVID happened and all these events stopped happening, obviously. And so it was then a stage of, do I still have a job? I don't know. Like, this is really awful. And there was a huge restructure that happened and redeployment within the company. And I ended up being put on a project that was the Nightingale Hospital, which was, if for those who might not know, like a huge temporary hospital put up in the Excel Centre in London, and during the height of COVID. And at the time, we didn't really know what it was going to be for. Like, we didn't know the extent of it, perhaps. And so I ended up being drawn into work in the centre of London. I was living in London at the time, and it was during the time where, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but during the pandemic, like, people would mug people for their IDs if they worked in jobs where they could skip the line in supermarkets. And it was a thing in London. Of course, it was a thing in London, right?
Of course, yeah.
And to get the pasta, like just the essentials. And so I was in uniform and was like surrounded by like 3 people at a bus stop, and was like, oh my God, this is happening. Got on the bus. Luckily, they all scattered and it was all fine. But got to work, had a huge panic attack. It was horrible. Like, I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Like, I don't need to work in the office. Like, I could totally do this at home. And so that was like the start of it. And then it turned up, and it ended up me living out of a hotel in central London for like 6 weeks or so, not being surrounded by friends or family, but just purely living to work. And then going back and being so exhausted from working, probably like double my hours at that point, like kind of similar to Sky. And just being so exhausted that all I could do was try and get sleep and then go back. And so it was probably one of the worst times of my life. But
and
at the same time,
when you couldn't even, you know, lean on your family or anyone, because you couldn't see anyone because we're already locked down.
Yeah, well, also there was no choice, because I'm from the north, so even if they were like local to London, I couldn't like go up and see them. So it was not pleasant. And so having that, but then also having a job where I felt like everything I did really mattered, and I was obviously passionate about it, like I loved that job, but it then kind of led me to just working nonstop forever, and then it certainly took its toll. My mental health plummeted, and so, and unfortunately in that position, the leadership didn't really understand mental health in the same way, and so wasn't very receptive to me needing time off. I was denied a lot of the toil that I would have accrued during that time as well, because there was no policy around it, of course. And so it was very difficult for me to be able to trust seniority again until I've come back into this job. So it was really hard. And I think, again, bringing it back to what we can do to support each other instead of being all like doom and gloom, knowing the signs, knowing when you're burning out, when you're in need of support, but knowing other people's signs of needing support as well is really important. And if you don't know about a policy that's in place that maybe would prevent that from happening, ask about it, seek it out, see if that's something that you could start implementing change in, because that's really important. And having buy-in from every single level within a company is incredibly important for when these things happen. It's not just you fighting for your own position. So that was kind of like my experience in burnout and crunch together. And yeah, it's really hard. And it's not something that you can just kind of shake off. So it's important to know your boundaries, know your limits, and try, I know it's easier said than done, try not to put yourself in a position where you're going to be taken advantage of, because it's very easy to do that and less easy to work yourself out of a hole once you're in it. So yeah, which is kind of why we talk a lot about, when you're first applying for jobs, the questions you can ask in terms of like, what mental health policy do you have? Like, what's your policy on mental health leave? What's your has anyone in leadership had like management training before? Because that's a huge thing. So yeah, there's like loads of different things that we can do, and I won't list them all off, but it's.
Do you have a list of them somewhere on your site? Because I think there'd be lots of people, you know, kind of coming into the industry or new in the industry that would find that very useful.
We do have, for our LevelUp partners specifically, a resource that talks about burnout and things that you can do. It's also part of our template policy. But in terms of things that are community facing, my best recommendation, and I'll grab the link for it, would probably be our student toolkit. It is aimed at students who are looking to enter the industry, but like with the CM1, there's stuff in there that's really good for anyone who's looking for a job in the industry and that's broadly applicable. The way that it's formatted is the front half of the toolkit kind of talks about anxiety, depression, burnout, and imposter syndrome. So some of the bigger players in terms of mental illness in our industry. It gives definitions and also signposts to support for those specifically. But then the latter half of the toolkit that we worked on with grads in games talks about how to get a job in the industry, but it does specifically have a list of sort of green flags and things that you can check whether a company has implemented that will demonstrate that it is more likely to be a good workplace. So I'll just grab the link for.
I'm ahead of you.
Incredible. Thank you. Sweet. I
think some will find that really useful. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, anytime. I can see that in the questions channel, we do have a question from Rob. It says, there are a lot of studies relating to shorter work weeks to help people have a better work-life balance. In your opinion, what is a reasonable work week to expect? Now, I personally am a huge advocate for the 4-day work week. I think that it has been implemented very successfully in other territories, and there is evidence from those territories to suggest that it is working and it isn't having a negative impact on the productivity of the company. And it's actually something that some companies, and actually increasingly more companies in the games industry, are starting to implement either on a company-wide level or on a flexible level. So off the top of my head, I know that Chucklefish sort of posted on LinkedIn and tweeted about the fact that they've implemented that lately. And a couple of other partners that I've spoken to have done it, and for them it's working well. I think that it maximizes the amount of time that you can be productive, and it also helps to prevent things like burnout because you have more time to recover and focus on self-care and doing things that you enjoy, which in turn puts you in a better position. Because I mean, even if you're not at the point of burnout, if you are working a lot, that time that you spend working is not productive for a full 8-hour day, 5 days a week. That's not all productive time. And by shortening the work week, you are actually focusing on the amount of time that you can be productive. And research demonstrates that the kind of net output in terms of product is the same. I can see as well that as a follow-up, different people have different tolerances to burnout. How do we go about balancing policies to ensure both individual staff members and companies are gaining a net benefit? In response to that, I will let Rosie chime in a sec, but in response to that one, I would say that from a managerial level, that's where training really comes into play. A lot of people who are responsible for HR in organizations actually don't have any formal training, which is quite shocking, really, because if you think about it, pretty much any other senior leadership position, like accounting or distribution or whatever, you need to have qualifications for that. And I'm not saying that it's not the same in HR. There is things like the CIPD, but they're not always required for these types of roles. So a lot of times, and especially for line managers, who HR isn't their entire role, but is increasingly required of them, these people don't have the training in order to approach things flexibly, and will often stick to the letter of the policy, which when you're talking about something as diverse as all the topics covered by HR and as sort of broad as mental health, it requires flexibility, and training is what you need to be able to deal with situations flexibly. So being able to approach each employee in terms of their tolerance to burnout differently, as opposed to having one policy that you expect everyone to adhere to, is something that I would recommend seeking training for. And it's something that we try, through LevelUp to help with in terms of providing that training that allows people to think about situations a little more flexibly. Before I move on to any of the other stuff, Rosie, did you want to jump in on any of that?
I was just going to add that I think it's very valuable to schedule time in specifically to talk about these issues within the work week. A lot of the time I see something called an open door policy, which on the surface sounds great, but actually dedicating time that you are able to raise these concerns and talk about it instead of feeling like you're intruding on someone's workday is incredibly valuable for people, to know that they're going to be listened to. And so having that time to check in, to go through things, to, like Sky mentioned earlier, about having a manager who understands to ask how you're doing and how your workload is regularly, rather than just like, oh, we did our yearly check-in, so we're good. That's so valuable. And so I think just there is so much value in having a dedicated time and space for people to talk about how they're doing at work and what support they might be needing, even if it's not used for that. There's a space for that. And even if you go and you're like, I've got nothing to raise, great, that's not a problem. But you have an opportunity to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And those things shouldn't only be approached when
there's
they're bad.
Issue.
I mean, so with the example that I said, in my role 5 months ago, I was a bit bored. I needed more work. But 2 months ago, I had a lot of work to do and I was feeling quite stressed about it. Things can change, and the way that you need to approach work can change.
Yeah, and I think companies being proactive, or managers being proactive about it rather than reactive, is actually a humongous thing in terms of helping their employees or their colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so Rob, the same person who asked the 2 questions we've just gone over, also added, I know the second question comes across as won't someone think of the $1 million companies, but every discussion needs balance, and people gaming policies is not unheard of. Companies definitely take advantage of staff a lot, but staff can also take advantage of the policies. I would say with regard to that, you're right, people do take advantage of policies, and that is something that a line manager or an HR person or whoever can address on an individual level. But I would always say, have the policies in place. Because if one person, takes the piss a little bit and games the policy, but the rest of the organization's mental health and well-being is supported by it, let them. Because the net worth of having something like that in place is so much more than, one person maybe getting away with something that they probably shouldn't or something like that. So it should be addressed, but I would always say put stuff in place, because it's better to have it and have a couple people maybe take advantage than to not have it at all and have people suffering for it.
Yeah, because I know there's also some places that do like, you don't have like X amount of days of holiday, you have unlimited holiday and you take it when you need it. And it's really interesting because when I first heard of that, I was like, oh my gosh, people must just be like, haha, I don't have a job anymore.
It's
But for the most part, it doesn't work like that, because people are like, oh, I actually feel valued. I feel like I can take time when I need it. They end up not taking the piss. And actually, there's so much more like job satisfaction in that they will be more productive in the end as well. So I feel like it's really worth investing in your people, and trusting is a huge way to go with that, because not feeling trusted in a job is not it's not a great way to be able to move forward with the work that you're doing and create a healthy atmosphere to be in.
Also, if you don't feel trusted, like oftentimes you're just more likely to
leave,
leave, or like, I hate the term quiet quitting because it literally just means doing your bare minimum job. But do things or try and get away with things if you just feel like you're not valued or trusted anyway.
Yeah. Because they're like, well, I don't get what I should be getting from my job, therefore I will try and,
what's the point? Yeah,
I'll get advantages where I can find them, because there's not many, which I understand. So
I think the unlimited holiday is a really interesting talking topic actually. I know that there's been quite a lot of studies about it, and people are actually finding that they take less holiday than they would, which actually means that they end up working more and are actually more susceptible to burnout. So do you actually think that though that is a good idea for companies to put into place?
I think that because one of the things that I was going to add is about how I mentioned that Airship Interactive have a menstrual leave policy, and I think having a set amount of annual leave, but also having other instances like mental health days or like this menstrual leave policy is important, because it means that you have the annual leave that you need to take, and your line manager can determine whether you have taken enough or not. And I do think that that's incredibly important. But having flexibility to have other days when you need them is huge. So I think
it's almost like having like a minimum amount of holiday you need to take over a year, because everybody needs to take time off of work, even if they're really passionate about their job.
Like you can take as much as you want, but you should take these breaks. So we spoke with Joe from Airship about a couple of things, but the menstrual leave policy being quite a big one that we talked about. We'll be putting some clips like the one that we looked at with Tracy out on our socials for people who aren't LevelUp partners, if you're interested. But for anyone who is a LevelUp partner, it's already available on the website for you. But we talked to him about the menstrual leave policy, and it's literally just a policy where if you are menstruating and suffering from it, you can just take the day off, and it's not, like counted as like a sick day or anything that affects your statutory sick pay.
Kind of stigma around that is enormous.
Yeah, it's something that I'm really, really interested in talking about. But that is a good example of a policy that you might expect people could game quite easily. Like if I don't want to work, I'll just call up and say I'm on my period or whatever. But ultimately, from what you can see, because I would say follow Airship on LinkedIn, because they've posted so much about this menstrual leave policy, and they've got like interviews and quotes from their employees about it, and I'm just like, I'm such a fan of how much they talk about that. But if you look at sort of the output from the employees and the things that they've said about it on LinkedIn, being put in that position where you feel trusted and also supported when you're going through something that can be really difficult. Even if you don't have endometriosis, like menstruating can be really hard, and it can put you in a position where, like, God, you the last thing that you feel capable of doing is going to work. And actually having that trust put in you that you can make that decision and take those days, they found that there wasn't a huge amount of uptake at first, but gradually it's been increasing as the sort of stigma around it reduces. But they haven't had a point where people are taking every single month off, like the same number of days, or like they're not taking the piss, because they appreciate being valued and having that support in place.
The thing is, you take the piss of these policies and they're just going to disappear anyway. So I think
I wanted to look at the
George's got a question as well.
Yeah.
because that's a really interesting question.
I'll let you do the reading for that one.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. I was always picked as a narrator in school because apparently I could read well, and then I'm like panicking now in case I mess it up. But anyway, the question is, why do you think employers struggle to see crunch culture as a direct result of mismanagement or inefficient planning? Why do most management teams see crunch as a necessity or unavoidable part of work culture rather than something that can be addressed and potentially repaired on a higher up level? Which is a very good question. And I think it's very common, like weirdly enough. We speak to a lot of people, and I see a lot of people on like social medias talking about this as well. And a lot of people do see crunch, oh well, it's just how it is. And I think it's that weird like sort of generational thing, not like necessarily that it's generational in that respect, but like it's something that's always happened, therefore it almost must happen. And I think a lot of people see change as a scary thing, which is certainly a part of it in my mind. But some people, I think that they don't see the genuine effect of crunch because they're not in the position that they're being crunched on, if that makes sense. Or they actually, some people enjoy crunch, which is a strange thing. But it's very complex, and I think it depends on person to person. But I think it needs to be a conversation that involves everyone rather than just the management teams, for example, because often it's, like I said, it's very much a case of distributing the work unevenly and not seeing the payoff in that respect. But yeah, it's a hard question.
It's kind of like that same argument with student loan forgiveness, for example. Like, well, I paid off my student loans, so why should someone else not have to? Like, why should we try and change crunch culture? Because when I was working as a dev, all I did was crunch, and I slept under my desk, and if I can do it, everyone else can do it. And I do think that the fact that it is so ingrained in the culture of the industry means that it's so much more difficult to change. Like, enacting cultural change is one of the most challenging things because you are aiming to change the fundamental way that people think. And that's why, I mean, it's something that our entire goal as a charity is to kind of chip away at slowly but surely, because that's, how you enact change. And we need to highlight the companies that are doing it well, which is, again, what we're aiming to do through the LevelUp Best Practice Hub. And eventually that kind of thing will become the norm. But as with any social or cultural change, it takes a very long time. And it takes a lot of sort of the like older industry folks, and like Rosie, I don't necessarily mean old, but the people who've been in the industry for a long time, to
veterans
sort of that's a good one, thank you. But it takes a lot of those industry veterans to change their minds, or for new people to move into those positions, for that change to actually happen. So it is a long road. But I do think, in answer to the question, that's kind of why, is because it's such a cultural thing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's difficult, and I think it's important as well not just to stress the moral reasons why crunch is not great, but also like the business effectiveness reasons, which I think sometimes can hit home a little bit harder with management. Not to say that they're all soulless people, of course not, but like, what I mean, like there's multiple levels as to why crunch is damaging, and it's not just about how it makes people feel. It's also about the fact that people have left work because of this. People take time off. People need to be rehired. Like, there's so many things that are involved in crunch that are often not used in the argument as to why. And I think it's important to do that as well.
I mean, realistically, it's detrimental to both employees and employers. So getting it right is definitely key.
And I think, sorry.
So I was just going to go on to the next question, but if there's more, go.
Well, I was just going to add in, because what Rosie was saying kind of made me think about this. And I think with crunch specifically, that's something that the games community rather than the industry can actually have a huge impact on. Because a lot of the reason why people like aim to hit specific deadlines is because of the amount of vitriol and backlash they'll receive from the community if they have to push their game back from the expected release date. Like, I have used this example basically every time I've ever talked about crunch, but I will wait for Breath of the Wild 2 as long as it takes. You can push that game back as many times as you want, because I, number one, want a good game, but I, number two, want the people who are working on it to not be unwell, and I want them to like have a nice time making a product that's going to bring so many people joy. But yeah, I think that the more that the attitudes change within the games industry, and the more people who don't get upset from having to wait so long for a game to release, the easier it will be for like upper management. Sorry, I'm like, he's gonna mute me or like end the call or something. He's
done that in the past, yeah.
It's true. But the more people who are willing to wait for a game, the easier it will be for, you know, the decision makers to make the decision to hold the game, because it's not going to cause such an issue with the community.
Yeah, we've also seen as well like discussions happening around people who, consumers are less likely to buy products when they know that the staff have been treated immorally. Yeah. And that's huge. Like, that's actually going to affect the sale of your games. If you think about how many people refuse to play X game because of this reason that they saw, like, that's powerful. And I think it's also something really to consider about like what is worth more to you, you know? So yeah, community has the power to do a lot of things, both positive and negative, but it's definitely something to take into account.
Yeah.
Laura's asked a question about holiday, saying that actually when she goes on holiday, you know, you end up putting stuff off and you end up coming back to such a workload that you're more stressed than when you went away. So how do you kind of tackle that to avoid burnout after coming back from a holiday to this massive workload?
So I think, again, this is something that leads me back to that need for people to be flexible when dealing with HR or people management practices. But as an example, one of the things that my previous company, the one where I was, you know, in constant front-facing appointments, one of the things they implemented is if you have X number of days off, you can have half a day to catch up on things when you get back, where we're not going to schedule you any appointments. And then, you know, if you have, you know, 2 weeks off, for example, you get a full day. And I think having that kind of basic policy in place is really helpful, because it takes the pressure off that you're not expected to just hit the ground running and jump straight back into it. You have time to, you know, look at everything and not get overwhelmed and prioritize. And that's something that I think is good to have in place as like a base policy. But then there's that whole being flexible. You need to do what is going to work for each individual employee, and someone might need, you know, if they've been off for like 2-3 days, they might need a full day. Like, and that's, I'm sorry, that's like, he's being such a menace today. They might need a full day, and that sort of leads you into the conversation around reasonable adjustments. And if you can't work based on that standard policy of how they deal with annual leave or whatever, you can ask for an adjustment to be put in place that you specifically might have X amount of time, or even like your first day back, you might have a half day because it might just be very stressful for you, and it might be an anxiety trigger or something like that to go back into a full 8-hour shift or something like that.
How would you encourage somebody to kind of initiate the conversation? Because these conversations are quite hard, kind of, you know, to have with managers and stuff, especially, you know, if you work in these big studios. So how would you encourage somebody to have that conversation?
So it's something that I would recommend disclosing, you know, at the point of hiring or at the point of diagnosis, if it happens after hiring that you are struggling with these types of things. As an example, I suffer from depression and generalized anxiety disorder. And that is something that I made clear when I joined this role at Safe, although at that time I didn't feel like I needed any reasonable adjustments. So I was like, hey, just so you know, I have this, but I don't need anything changed at that point. Obviously, at that point, you can also ask for an adjustment to be put in place. But it's something that, as someone in a managerial position, I would build into those regular check-ins that we've discussed, because your need for an adjustment can change. An example of this could be that I recently attended an event for work where I didn't get any of the information around attending that event, like what time I needed to be there, the actual location I was going to, what time it finished, etc., until literally the day before in the afternoon. And that I was extremely stressed. And like, for someone who has anxiety, that is such a trigger for me. I was really panicking about it. I was struggling to sleep for a few days beforehand because I was just really stressed about not knowing all of the facts. So after that circumstance, I realized that's something I probably need an adjustment in place for. So I said to my manager, hey, like, if I agree to do an event again, can I have the information, like 5 days in advance, for example, and then have the flexibility if I don't have the information that 5 days in advance to say, actually, no, I'm not going to do the event anymore because it's causing me undue stress and pressure. So that's an example of like an adjustment that I didn't know I needed in place initially, but I asked for later down the line. And in terms of going into more detail about how to ask for a reasonable adjustment, it's something that we discussed in our recent panel on chronic illness. So even though that is more focused around physical illness rather than mental illness, we did have a really, really good chat about one, like the anxiety course. I can see Rosie's getting the link. Thank you.
I was just like, I need to do this action.
But it's something that we talked about, the anxiety that is involved around asking for those adjustments, because even though it's more than likely not going to be the case, it can be so scary to ask for something to change. And it, again, leads into that whole like, oh, I can't ask for something because I'm lucky to be here, or blah, blah, blah. No one else is asking for it. So we talk specifically about that feeling. And we also talk about examples of reasonable adjustments and how they were implemented and how they were reviewed. So I'd really recommend checking out that panel if you want to kind of dive into the whole reasonable adjustment thing a little bit more.
Thank you.
Rosie, did you have anything on that question from Laura that you wanted to kind of add?
Yes, I'm just trying to go back to the original question because my mind's like, wait, where was it?
No, it's all good.
Oh, yeah, about holidays and stuff. And yeah, so it was also kind of my answer was kind of already answered as well by Anina, but having a day where nothing is scheduled, I have no calls. My colleagues know just not to bother me. I'm just like, we'll have a catch up at 10 a.m. and I'll be like, hey, I've got so much to catch up on. So like, I'm just going to go and do that. And they're like, okay, no worries. See you tomorrow. And having like dedicated time to do nothing but catch up is important, which can also be supported by your colleagues. So let's say if there's if you know that you're going to be delivering a talk the week after, maybe like kind of being like, hey, can I actually sidestep on this one and someone else can do it, so I have time to, like, planning ahead is very important. And also not being afraid to ask for help in distributing work whilst you're away. I don't think it's entirely reasonable to be expected to catch up on all of the work that you've missed and like work double time when you get back. I think that's really difficult. And so scheduling, like I'm in content, for example, so if I think actually it would be beneficial for my mental health and my planning and my time management if I missed a TikTok, for example, like cut down a little bit this week so I can actually prep properly and everything goes out well. I'll do that. Like I'll happily make that adjustment for myself as well. So I think it's dependent on you, but like for me, I am also a very anxious person. I like to schedule everything in advance, and so the week before I'll probably work really hard and like have everything up and ready to go, and then like do a handover, and then that's it. I don't have to think about it anymore. Like my mind isn't like constantly worrying about what I haven't done, which I think is another issue. I think when people go on holiday and they don't stop thinking about work, it's not a real holiday. Like you're still technically working, or like actually working. Some people will check in, and like that's a habit to try and get out of if you can, possibly, because it's when you're on holiday, it's important to not mentally work as well.
I had my first holiday and I did a complete digital detox, and I came back feeling so refreshed, and I can't recommend that highly enough to anyone. If you feel like you just need to just take yourself off and just completely detached from everything for just a little while.
I think sorry,
it was just so refreshing coming back.
That kind of thing is so important. So like I'm going to use my mum as an example in this one, because we were literally having this conversation like a couple of days ago, but in her workplace they have like a WhatsApp group where they'll just constantly be talking. Like throughout the entire weekend, she gets bombarded with messages on this WhatsApp. And it's not even like about work necessarily. It's just conversation, but that's still like the people that involve work means that she can't actually switch off from work.
Yeah.
So she needs to like, I was showing her how to like turn off the notifications and everything for that chat on WhatsApp, just so that she can separate herself mentally from that. So I think that that's an important thing to note as well, is that potentially on your holiday, you might want to think about just like not talking to your colleagues, and not in a horrible way, but just to separate that space. You know, like, sure, you might be great friends, but that person is probably going to signify work to you, and you're probably going to end up talking about work. Like when we were in the kind of miserable prior workplace that I was talking about with all the silly changes and things happening, when I took annual leave, like all I would get from my colleagues is like, you'll never guess what they've just said to us now, or like, this is the new process that they've put in place. So that in turn led to the burnout I was feeling, because even when I was not physically in work, I was still having like emotional stress from what's happening at work.
Yeah, setting boundaries as well is really important. Like, I'm a very community facing person, and so a lot of people see me as like, I'm glad see me as approachable, which is great. But if I get approached about work things in like personal social medias or outside of work hours, I will, for the most part, be like, hey, can you just email me this actually? Because I don't want to talk about work on my evenings, because it doesn't help. And like, I know so many community managers that are also in that boat as well, because a lot of the time it can feel very time restrictive. If someone sends you a message on social media, you're like, oh my God, what if I forget about it? Like, it's going to skip my mind. Twitter's going to die in the meantime. I'm never going to be able to answer them. Like, you know, just the usual worries that you have. And so, you know, being able to say like, hey, can you just put it here? That's where I'll action it. Or like, can you ask me tomorrow?
That actually,
okay to say.
It leads really well into I posted about this event on a different server, and they couldn't come, but they did ask me to ask you a question, which was an issue I have with burnout is being a solo community manager and managing always online game Discord communities. Do you have any tips on how to manage 24/7 communities without being 24/7 yourself?
Yes. We do that at the moment. So we have our Safe in Our World Discord community, which is 24/7 and global, so it can be really overwhelming. And I think it is important to stress that it's okay to ask for help. It's good to have a support team in place, and having moderators that are in different time zones is a godsend, because you don't have to worry about like, oh, what if something happens while I'm asleep? Other people will be there to take responsibility as well, so the pressure is not all on you. Also, setting up rules within Discord so that you have actionable things to like do. So if someone is clearly breaking a code of conduct, you can be like, this is exactly why what's happened has happened. I'm going to ban you now, and this is why. And like, they help you justify your actions as well, which is really important. You can also include like a lot of different security measures around sorry, was the question specifically about Discord or just communities in general?
About Discord, yeah.
Okay, cool. So this will be making sense. So there's so many different security measures you can put in place on Discord to make it a safer place when you're not there. So for example, we have certain trigger words that will get a bot to send support lines to you if you mention them, which often aren't needed and it's just part of a conversation, but I would so much rather someone had support lines that they didn't need than someone didn't have them when they did. So we have that in place. We obviously have banned words and things that we do not allow in the server. There's a lot, we have like two-factor verification to be able to get in, and like you have to have a verified email address and stuff, which is again really important, especially when you've got like bots and people who are there just to troll you, which is sadly the reality for a lot of games communities. But also like setting up a strategy in place to know that like it's not just you is really like, it puts my mind at ease. Like, I know that also if you have these boundaries within the community and the community members are generally like very respectful of those boundaries, but also emanate the community feel that you're after, then they will also support you in that. So if someone, I think we've got to the point now in our server where if someone says something disrespectful, if I don't get there in time, I can already know that a few other community people will be like, hey, that's not cool. Or like, maybe think about it in this different way, which is so cool, because I'm just like, that's amazing. And it shouldn't always have to be the people with the band hammers to come over and be like, no, that's breaking the rules. So yeah, I think it's about fostering an inclusive and safe community from the very beginning, but also backing it up with all these extra steps as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that the only thing that I would add to that is, if you really are sort of on your own, as in there is literally not anyone else, you don't have mods, there's no one else who can be monitoring that, which is sometimes the situation that like content creators are in with their personal discords and that kind of thing. Having those like auto mod features in place is vital, but also being clear about your working hours and when you will and won't be available, and actually sticking to that so that people know if it's not within, your usual time of being active, that they shouldn't be necessarily trying to reach you about whatever. Like, so that boundary setting element is really important. And that's where our community manager training course comes into play, because I would really recommend, if you haven't been on that and you are, responsible for a community, like running that Discord or whatever, that you go on that. We don't have any courses announced at the moment, but we'll be running 3 more at the beginning of next year. So we'll be announcing the dates on that soon. And that is free to literally anyone in the industry. So keep an eye on our socials for the announcement of that and get yourself booked on, because that course talks specifically about that situation of like being always online and needing to set boundaries and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you. I'll share the link with her as well.
Awesome.
Just a couple of questions that I have myself, really. What can employees do if their employers are putting on pressure to do hours way above their contract? What actually are we able to do practically?
It's difficult, because whatever I'm about to say, I will give it the massive caveat that it's always easier said than done. And I do appreciate that wholeheartedly, and have been personally in that situation where I don't feel capable of like practicing what I preach because of the specific situation.
Yeah.
However, I would always be aware of your legal rights in terms of overtime and compensation. I know that there are a lot of like very stringent rules around that in the UK, which will obviously differ internationally, and in some places sort of contracts and employment law isn't as detailed as it is in the UK, but I would be aware of what your legal rights are, because if they are asking you to do something that is not legal in terms of overtime and things like that, then obviously you are fully within your right to say no and tell them that what they're asking you to do is illegal if it is like not compensating you for overtime and things like that. I would also, on top of that, again, it being really easy for me to say in this position now than for people to necessarily act on, but I would say be as strict with your boundaries with your employer as you would be with your community, and just say, I am not going to work for you this weekend. I have plans. I'm not going to cancel my holiday to meet this deadline. I am not going to work after 6 o'clock because it is outside of my working hours. I will do that for you first thing in the morning when I get in, but I'm not going to do it this evening. And I know that is such a scary thing to say. And it's kind of a vicious cycle whereby if you are in a company that hasn't tackled this kind of thing and doesn't have these support processes in place, it can be really difficult to start to say that thing. And you can sort of fear for, your job security, and not necessarily just in being fired, but in the way that you're treated in work. But where possible, I would say be your own advocate, and also advocate for other people. If you see someone else who's being, mistreated or asked to do things that is unreasonable, speak up for them, because it's often a lot easier to, sort of put your parent head on and try and help someone else than it is to advocate for yourself.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also like document everything just in case. Like, it's good to have it on hand, isn't it? To be like, here are all the explicit times where someone does ask me to do something that's above and beyond my role, and this is why I think it's not appropriate, because it's important to be able to, like, I'm in the position, not now, but like I was in the position sometimes where I would have things to say, and then I got in there and was like, oh, maybe I'm over it, like thinking this, maybe I'm just being a bit silly, no, wasn't being silly. But some people have a way of talking you around and making you think like, oh, it's really not that bad. Like, we'll be here to support you. And so like having concrete things to be like, no, this is what happened. This is, like, it's important to have those as well, for your own peace of mind, I think, as well. So yeah.
And it also may be that, especially people working within small studios, their employer might not even know that they're doing it.
Yeah.
Because I think, you sometimes get that, don't you? When people are really passionate about what they're doing, they just don't even think that this is probably not appropriate to ask someone to do, or this is above their job.
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly. Because you might think, oh, well, I would do that, but that's not how you should think as a manager. It's again looking at flexibility and looking at people as people rather than just workers.
Yeah, and coming back to that training that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
This isn't a question, but just picking up on what I can see people talking about in chat, about how they feel like they're being called out for being a night owl or that they're always working really late. I would say, honestly, that's fine. Like, I'm not saying that you can't work past 6 o'clock, because I'm also, or would consider myself, a night owl. And sometimes you just get struck with inspiration at specific times. Yeah, Rosie, I'm looking at you here.
I know, I'm sorry.
But, and especially with us in a global organization, sometimes you have to do calls like late at night because you're talking to someone in the US or whatever. It's okay to not work normal office hours. Like, not everyone has to do like a 9 to 5. What I would say is, if you are working late because that's a preference for you, and that might be like an adjustment that you have in place, don't start at 9. Like, take the time back. If you're going to work late, start late, and make sure that you're not working more just because you're working different hours.
I'm literally not working tomorrow because of that exact reason, because I had a late podcast to record with someone who was on PST on Tuesday, and tonight I'm going to an event, and I was like, that's enough time for me to warrant not working tomorrow, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, just value your time, because it's important, and not feeling, it's getting past the guilt for me, I think, is the issue. Is that being like, if it was someone else, I'd be like, totally, you worked last night, take the morning off. But if it's me, I'm like, no, I don't deserve it. I must power through. It's not right.
That's why
you're
it's
also
important
a small team, are they, right?
Sure, but it's nothing that
we get that in our marketing team. We're a small team, so you kind of feel like, if someone's, even if you've worked over your hours, you still go, oh no, but I still need to do this in the morning, or I still need to do this tomorrow, and it's so easy to do that.
But it's
that's
easy
why
to get
it's on everyone to
it,
advocate for you.
Yeah.
I can see like some people in the chat are saying like, oh, they'll always like message their colleague if they see them online at 11 p.m. And I've done the same thing for Rosie. I remember you did like, I think it was for Intel, you did like a call really, really late in the evening at like 10 p.m. But then you were like still working afterwards because you had that like burst of inspiration. And I was like, what are you doing? Get off. And you were like, no, I have to do this now. And I was like, okay, but you're not working in the morning.
Yeah, I'm always telling Anina off at that. Get off.
Yeah, but like, because it's like, I know that I have I get bursts of energy at the weirdest times, and I like to take advantage of them, especially if I'm already at my desk. I'm like, amazing, I'll just do this real quick, and then I'll take an hour off tomorrow, and that's okay. It's just making sure that you take the hour. And telling 100%. Other people, getting accountability for that, and being like, hey, I'm working late, therefore can you make sure that I actually switch off tomorrow at 4 o'clock instead of 5? Like, that's reasonable to ask.
Yeah. Or like, I'm Rosie's personal lunchtime alarm.
I am known to have 5 o'clock lunches. I don't know why. I don't know what it is. It's
you just get swept up in something, don't you?
But
I'll often check in and be like, hey, how's your lunch going? Knowing full well that you're still at your desk.
Rob's asked if you're allowed to name drop any studios companies who are doing a good job with dealing with burnout and crunch, because we're always hearing negatives and what companies don't do rather than the companies that are nailing it.
Yeah, so I'll name a couple of specific ones, but I am going to caveat that this is just the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. And there are so many companies doing so many really good things that I would recommend like checking out the LevelUp page that I linked on our website, because we've got all of our partners listed there. And pretty much all of them I have spoken to specifically about these types of policies, and I know that they've got stuff in place. But that being said, we've heard from Sega, and that was their Hardlight studio that Tracy works at. Airship, obviously, I've already said I'm such a...
No,
I've lost her again.
How they talk about it openly on their socials and things as well. Oh no, am I back?
You're back.
No, you're back.
Okay, I'm sorry. And also I'm sorry if you can hear my other cat screaming. Oh my gosh. So I mentioned Sega, I mentioned Airship, I mentioned Chucklefish as one of those that's pioneering like a shorter work week, and they also gave all of their employees like a huge pay rise for the cost of living crisis, which was so cool. I would say that from recent conversations that I can remember, Whitethorn Games have been doing really well at like making sure that they've got the policies in place, and their CEO Matt has also published a book on mental health, so you can tell that he's really like invested in it on a personal level.
He also came on the podcast with us. Would recommend checking it out. He was great.
He was on our podcast too. He's a really cool person to talk to. I would say that the Ubisoft Reflections studio that I talked about, where Julia is a sleep ambassador, they're doing a lot of really cool things within their studio, and also a network of sort of, I think, 5 other studios in the UK. Don't quote me on that exactly. But they're doing some really cool stuff and implementing things, and they have a lot of mental health first aiders trained up so that they have people who are equipped to handle these situations like burnout and crunch. Rosie, can you think of anyone else off the top of your head?
The only one that comes to mind at the moment is I see a lot of cool stuff from Neon Hive, who have just also gone down to a 4-day working week, which is really cool. And from what I hear, like Disobey sounds like a really cool place to work as well. But again, that's from what I've seen. I'm not as much involved in policy and stuff as Sky, so it's hard for me to quote specific companies. But just from what I've seen and what I've heard from people, those are the 2 that come to mind.
Yeah, I would say definitely check out our page on LevelUp where all the companies are listed, but also like check out the company's socials, because as Rosie said with Neon Hive, as I've said with Airship and Chucklefish, like usually the companies that are doing really well in those areas will be shouting about it, because it's something you should celebrate, absolutely. And pretty much every company I know that is doing an do talk about it on socials.
100%. But then there's also, it's important to note that a lot of people do great things and don't shout about it, which is so like, it hurts my heart, because I'm like, you're doing so much cool stuff, you need to tell people. And they're
they
like,
don't want to brag. That's what it is.
Well, not even that. I think they just think, oh, well, it's just kind of a given. And I'm like, no,
you should do it.
You should absolutely advertise the amount of support that you give people, because that will also implicate people who apply for jobs knowing that it's a safer place to work than other places. So yes, we're all about shouting about the good in that.
100%. I'm really sorry, ladies. This has been amazing, and thank you so much. But I've just realised we are already over time. I could talk about it all day long, and I can't thank you enough. I think you can see from the amount of general chatter that our community has enjoyed this. So thank you so much. And Sky, I look forward to working with you more with the LevelUp partnership.
Yeah, awesome. It's been so nice to have this chat and see everyone who's like-minded in chat, and thank you all for your input and your really good questions and really thoughtful questions. So thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.